Hello, and welcome back to another episode of The Rest Day with Jack Haig. This episode's going to be a bit of a life update, I guess, and another solo episode, seeing as a lot of people seem to like the previous solo episode. Now, since then, I've recorded two more episodes, one with Mateusz Gobeka, a teammate of mine, before he went to America to race Unbound, and then another one with Carlos Rodriguez from Ineos, who went on to win the final stage of Criterium Dauphiné and finish quite well on the GC in Dauphiné. Now, since the last one, I went to Frankfurt for the one-day World Tour race, but unfortunately that didn't really go so well for me. I ended up flying there, having dinner the 2 nights before the race and getting some food poisoning. And I basically spent 36 hours in a hotel in Germany and then flew home again, which wasn't ideal. And after that, I went off to do some Tour de France recon. We went to go recon the stage 9 gravel and the stage 7 individual time trial. The stage 9 gravel, it's probably a stage where you're not going to win the Tour de France, but it's definitely a stage where you can lose it. And it's highly likely we see one, maybe two of the top GC contenders at least have a problem there and maybe fall out of contention. The gravel, when we reconned it, was maybe a little bit better than I expected. But then again, it was at the end of winter after some rain and cold. So I imagine the gravel was probably a little bit more compact than what we'll see in the Tour de France during the summer. We went there to test some equipment and also just to give a bit of peace of mind on what the course is going to be like. We rode the last 60, 70 kilometers of the stage. The stage is 200 kilometers in total. We tested tire sizes all the way from the 28 millimeters, which we normally use, all the way up to 35 millimeter tubeless Continental GP 5000s. And I think we'll probably settle on either 30 or 32 millimeter tires with the Merida Reacto frame, which is the more aerodynamic sort of harsher frame, just because there's not that much climbing elevation and it'll be quite fast. After that, the stage 7 time trial is 25.2 kilometers long and also relatively straightforward. The recon is mainly just to give, again, a bit of peace of mind and to be able to sort of mentally visualize what the stage is going to be like when we arrive there in the tour. It's pretty straightforward. There's one shortish climb 2/3 of the way through. When we went to do the recon, they were resurfacing all of the downhill off this climb, and it's beautiful, smooth, hot mix all the way to the bottom and then relatively straightforward to the finish. After the recon, I had a week at home before heading off to Tenerife, where we did a 16-day altitude camp. I always enjoy going to Tenerife, to be honest. There's a smaller group. We normally go there with 4 to 6 riders and again, maybe 4 or 5 staff members, and you just get to spend a bit more relaxed time together. Whereas in sort of the December or January training camps, it's so busy and there's so many people there, you never actually get to connect that much with the staff or your teammates. And in a race, it's obviously also quite different. Another advantage of being in Tenerife was you get to sort of hang out with your coach, which is something that's a little bit different in cycling compared to other sports where you might see your coach daily at a training venue, whereas in cycling, it can be quite often that you don't see your coach for months in person. And the last time I saw Giannis, my coach, was in December training camp. And then I wasn't there in January because I went to Australia. So Tenerife camp was a nice opportunity to get to know each other a little bit more, to learn about each other's personalities, what we prefer, and also for him just to be able to see me on the bike. He's in the car following us every day with water, food, and everything, support in the car in case something goes wrong. But he's also there just to see how you are on the bike, to sort of look at your face, to have a bit of a conversation with you when you finish, an interval to sort of gauge the fatigue and the load that you're under to better manage how to get the most out of the training camp in altitude. Now, normally in Tenerife, the weather's always super hot, but this year we actually had relatively overcast and maybe not such ideal weather. It was sort of 18 to 22 degrees every day with a little bit of cloud. The way that it works is it's quite a small island that's just a volcano. And then as you descend down from sort of the 2,200 meters where we stay in the Parador Hotel, you sort of pass through a bunch of different environmental climates, I guess, as you descend down to sea level. And quite often we would have to descend down through some cloud at around 1,000 meters elevation. And it's the first time I think that I've needed to use a rain jacket while I've been in Tenerife before Dauphiné. And another thing that was quite different this year was there was only Ineos in the hotel, whereas previously the hotel is normally full of teams and cyclists preparing for Tour de France. But this year, a lot more teams decided to do their pre-Dauphiné altitude camp in Sierra Nevada. And I guess that's probably because the time trial training in Tenerife is actually not that great. There's not very many flat roads. And quite often we end up doing a lot of the work on the time trial bikes up one of the climbs in Tenerife. For anyone that knows, there's a climb that goes up from a village called Chio up to the top of the island. And this climb's sort of 5%. And we end up doing a lot of the time trial work there. And I think a lot of the teams now went to Sierra because you have a lot of flat roads around Granada where you can do time trial training. And also in the Parador Hotel, there's not possible to have a team chef there. And there's one self-contained apartment with a kitchen, and generally Ineos rent this. And if you want to have a chef there, it's not possible. So I think a lot of teams went to Sierra Nevada to be able to control their nutrition a bit more, but also it's much easier to bring all the material. Now teams are bringing much more material to training camps, like time trial bikes for everyone, turbo trainers, everything that you might need. And it's just easier because Sierra Nevada's mainland Spain and you don't need to get a boat or transport everything on the aeroplane, which is always a little bit risky with damaging bikes and just expensive as well. After the training camp in Tenerife, I got to spend 5 days at home before going to Criterium Dauphiné. Now, these 5 days can be a little bit tricky to manage because you go from spending 16 days in this really focused, concentrated environment with the team around you where basically you don't really need to think about much and it's sort of autopilot and training happens relatively easily. You always have food prepared. You always have biddens there. You have the coach in the car behind you. It's quite easy to be motivated and the days just kind of tick off. And then when you come home, and especially you come home for just those 5 days, it can be quite hard to sort of switch your mind from being quite, so I guess maybe that selfish cyclist where all you're thinking about and all you're doing is training to then having to be a partner and a father and trying to get back into all the routines of cooking dinner, doing the laundry, figuring out which t-shirt's my son's favorite t-shirt now because over those 2 weeks it's changed, and then just adjusting to that routine. And in those 5 days, it's kind of important to try and stay on top of everything to make sure you don't take a small step backwards and maybe take away from some of the work that you did in Tenerife, but also trying to manage being there for my wife and being there for my son and making time for them. And then going into Criterium Dauphiné rested, but also in a good condition. In those 5 days, I only had sort of 2 hard days of training, and it can be kind of quite hard more mentally than anything else to go out there and after being in an environment where it was so easy to push yourself really hard to then do it when you're at home. And also that knowing that it's not so important because a lot of the work's already been done. I went off to Criterium Dauphiné with a relatively strong team there from Bahrain with myself and Santiago going there mostly for GC, but we also had Antonio Tabiri and 2 other guys from the Giro. And Tabiri, he did an amazing Giro. He was 5th overall, won the white jersey, and I think it was quite mentally hard to leave the Giro, have just 5 days at home, and then come to Dauphiné. I did it last year. It's super hard, mostly mentally more than physically. And especially for Antonio, who did 3 weeks riding GC, being mentally concentrated for that long and switched on, it's really hard to then have like 5 days at home and then re-switch on and start again hurting yourself and being concentrated and focusing on racing again. Now, we had the first 3 stages of Criterium Dauphiné, which were maybe more sort of sprint stages, but it was basically just stage 1 that was a pure sprint stage. And I think there was basically just 2 sprinters in the race. There was Sam Bennett from AG2R and Mads Peterson from Trek, and Mads won stage 1, and then stage 2 and 3 were kind of hard uphill drag sprints. There were still relatively big groups, I think maybe 40, 50 guys in the peloton, but it wasn't a proper sprint. I actually finished, I think 15th on both of those uphill sprint stages, which was okay. It gave me a little bit of confidence going into the stage 4 TT, which was actually a really hard time trial, 34 kilometers, with sort of the last 20 kilometers being quite undulating, quite hard, quite mostly uphill and sort of slow roads, like high rolling resistance roads. I really wanted to do a good time trial. The first part of the season, if you listen to the previous solo podcast I didn't really go so well for me. And this was kind of the first real test of the week to see how my condition was going towards the Tour de France, as well as for many of the other favorites like Remco. He's coming off the big crash that he had in Etzulia. Primoz also crashed in Etzulia with Bora, a new team. And a lot of guys were there trying to prove themselves to do the Tour de France. I did relatively well. I finished 18th, which was a good performance. I would have liked to have been maybe top 15 or just nudging around that top 10, but relatively solid performance. It was a course that you really need to pace quite well. And sort of to put that in perspective, I think for the first 15 kilometers, I did around 360, 370 watts. And then for the last 19 kilometers, I think I did around 410. So it was a real negative sort of split or negative paced course. Remco won, showing that he's in really good form on the time trial bike. And the crash in Etzulia hadn't affected him too much. Primoz came in third, around 30, 40 seconds behind Remco. And then a really strong ride from Matteo Jorgensen. Now, after that, we had another sprint stage, but this sprint stage, the weather wasn't great and we had a bit of rain throughout the stage. And for some reason in this area, the roads were incredibly slippery. There weren't too many crashes up until there was the really, really big crash that I'm sure a lot of people have seen. But a lot of guys in the descents before this one were slipping, but not quite crashing. Now, this descent came with about 30 kilometers to go. Everyone had been relatively conservative going up to this point, knowing that the roads were slippery. But of course, we all started racing for positioning at the top of the climb, because at the bottom of this downhill, there was about 20 kilometers to go and it was relatively technical. There was a series of many roundabouts in the last 20 kilometers, and in the morning, they'd already changed the 3 kilometer rule to 4 kilometers because it was so technical. And then maybe 800 meters down the descent, on the left-hand side of the road, it was relatively shiny and you could sort of see that it was quite wet and probably slippery. And I think just some of the UAE guys touched the brakes, and as soon as they touched the brakes, they just slid, which then put a bit of a ripple effect throughout the peloton, and more guys, as they were touching the brakes, just came down. I was quite lucky. I was maybe in the first 15 positions in the bunch as we went through this corner. And I was looking ahead, watching the TV motorbike in front. I saw he was braking into the corner, and I tried to slow down a little bit more. And as soon as I saw some of the guys next to me sliding out, you just automatically think, don't touch the brakes, take a very straight line as possible. And I just kind of went straight, tried to slow down as easily as I could, and I ended up riding in the grass for a little bit on the edge of the road, jumped back on the road. And the thing that maybe surprised me the most was how quickly the race organizer decided to neutralize the race. The time was neutralized. We stopped at the bottom of the downhill. It took a really long time for all the team cars and all the riders to arrive at the bottom just because of how many guys crashed. I think only 5 guys DNF'd the stage, but then over the next 3 or 4 days, so many guys continued to pull out with some probably lingering issues from that crash. In Bahrain, we actually had 3 guys not start the next day. 1 guy with a fractured pelvis, 1 guy with a suspected fractured wrist, and Rayner, he'd lost a lot of skin in the crash. After this stage, we had a series of 3 super hard back-to-back mountain stages, with probably the Queen stage being the Saturday. On the Friday stage, it was the easiest of the 3 stages with a relatively hard uphill finish. And I really wanted to do a good performance, mostly for my confidence. After not having the best start of the season, this was after the time trial, the next test, I guess. I tried positioning myself really well into the bottom of the climb, and Ineos took it up in maybe a Team Sky style train. I imagine it was something they'd been practicing in Tenerife, and they set a really solid tempo from the bottom of the climb. I tried to sit in sort of that top 10, 15 wheels and hang on as long as I could until about 3-4 kilometers to go when Lawrence Duplous attacked, and then the group split. I did a relatively good performance, tried to pace myself, not wanting to over exceed myself and then getting dropped. I just really wanted to do a good solid performance for my confidence. I finished 9th on the stage, just behind Remco, which then put me in 10th on GC going into Saturday stage. Unfortunately, there was a lot of sickness going around the peloton, as well as a lot of guys injured from this crash, and I started suffering with a bit of a sore throat and a bit of head cold. And the Saturday stage 7 didn't really go to plan 1. It was quite hard start to finish, and also raining. The weather in this Criterium Dauphiné was not typical. Normally, Criterium Dauphiné is super hot, really humid because we're coming out of the winter, and a lot of evaporation happening, and generally just feels like summer's sort of arriving. But this year it kind of felt a bit more like Paris-Nice than Criterium Dauphiné. And on this stage 7, we had quite a lot of rain, and we went over a few mountain passes where it was quite cold. And generally, I always suffer a little bit more in the rain and the cold. And with some sickness as well, I really didn't have the legs, which was quite disappointing. As soon as we arrived at the bottom of the final climb, I just didn't have anything left, and unfortunately dropped out of GC on this stage, which I was going the last 3 years. I finished 5th on GC 3 times in a row, and I really wanted to try and either finish 5th again or improve on GC. But after stage 7, that sort of disappeared, which is quite annoying. But for Bahrain, Santiago had a good performance. And then we went into stage 8, the final stage of this year's Dauphiné, and I sort of wanted to regather my confidence. I went into the stage wanting to do another good performance to try and finish off the week well, and I did okay. I was still suffering a little bit from some of that sickness, but I was 13th on the stage, which then put me on 16th overall in GC, which wasn't really what I was looking for when I was coming to Dauphiné. I really wanted to finish top 5, but yeah, sometimes it is what it is. After stage 8, it's always a bit of a mess depending on where a stage race or a race finishes of how you get home. And this time, luckily, we finished only about 45 minutes from Geneva Airport. We had good weather throughout the stage, but when we arrived to Geneva Airport, some flights started to get cancelled and delayed, and there was a big thunderstorm that came through, and it basically cancelled 80% of the flights in Geneva Airport, which was quite annoying. And with half the peloton basically flying from Geneva, some guys decided to stay the night in Geneva. Some guys, like myself, end up spending about 7 hours just hanging out in Geneva Airport waiting for an EasyJet flight, which continuously kept getting delayed. And eventually, instead of arriving in Barcelona at 8 p.m, I didn't arrive until about 1:15 in the morning, which kind of ruined my plans because I'd planned to meet the family in Barcelona Sunday night, have dinner, spend all Monday hanging out with them, and then driving back to Andorra. We still spent Monday with my family. We went to a nice cafe in Barcelona, tried to switch back on to being a partner and a father again. Spent most of the morning in the aquarium walking around, looking at fishes, sharks, stingrays, some penguins, and just trying to enjoy a little bit of downtime before coming back to Andorra and then switching back on to preparation for the Tour de France. Now I have a couple of days at home before we do another altitude camp in Andorra. So we'll spend 10 days at 2,000 meters in Andorra. There's only 3 guys. There's myself, Fred Wright, and Santiago Betrago are going there from the team. The team's sending across mechanic, soigneur, chef, and coach again. And again, it'll be nice to have my coach there. He can help monitor the training, the fatigue, and basically in this 2.5 weeks between the finish of Criterium Dauphiné and the start of the Tour de France, there's not really enough time to drastically change your form. I think you need to have already a solid foundation and a solid condition going into Criterium Dauphiné, but there's definitely enough time to sort of screw up your preparation. And I think some guys do mess up this period because it can be quite easy to want to overdo it or do too much. Whereas I think it's mostly about just kind of fatigue management, getting another stimulation of altitude to help prolong the effects of the altitude camp that we did before Dauphiné in Tenerife. And then just making sure that you do enough in training to keep the body at a high level, but make sure you're not carrying any fatigue into Tour de France. Obviously, Grand Tour 3 weeks long. It's really important to arrive in a really good condition, especially this year, because the first couple of stages are quite hard, but you don't want to arrive with any unnecessary lingering fatigue. I'll spend 10 days with the team there, then have a couple of days at home before traveling off to the Tour de France. In the altitude camp, Fred Wright will be there, and I'd like to do a podcast with him. So if you have any questions for Fred, or if you have any questions regarding anything I've mentioned in this podcast, then let me know either through the Discord channel of Escape Collective, message me on Instagram, and I'll try to do my best to answer the questions. Otherwise, I think that's about it for this update. Let me know if you enjoyed it. And as always, I hope you enjoyed listening, and talk to you guys soon.